They thought Thanksgiving dinner was the perfect stage to publicly erase me from my own family's legacy. My name is Mia Jones, and I sat at that mahogany table while my father handed my birthright to my incompetent brother, calling it a necessary sacrifice. He thought I was just the jealous sister destined to disappear into the background. He didn't know I had spent the last year quietly buying the company out from under him. They wanted a coronation, but I brought a coup. This is the story of how I turned their betrayal into my empire. Settle in for a story about justice served cold. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The dining room table was laid out like a battlefield, glistening with sterling silver and the heavy, suffocating weight of expectation. I walked into my parents' sprawling Midwestern home, the air thick with the scent of roasting turkey and expensive perfume, and felt my stomach tighten into a hard, cold knot. This wasn't a holiday dinner, it was a staging ground. The room was already packed, not just with immediate family, but with a strategic selection of witnesses, extended cousins, the deacons, from the small-town church my parents attended religiously for the networking, and a handful of gray-haired men who had managed the floor of Jones Metalworks for 30 years. Above the mahogany sideboard, the factory logo, a jagged gear with the family name stamped in iron, hung on the wall like a medieval crest. It was tacky, imposing, and exactly the kind of thing my father, Robert Jones, believed gave this house its soul. I scanned the seating chart and felt a familiar, bitter laugh rise in my throat. I was placed halfway down the table, squeezed between a deaf great-aunt and a floral centerpiece that blocked my view of the window. My older brother Cole, however, was seated at the head of the table right beside our father. My parents were in their element, polished to a high shine. My father wore a suit despite it being a Thursday afternoon in his own home, his posture stiff with self-importance. My mother, Karen, fluttered around Cole like a nervous bird, picking invisible lint off his blazer and refilling his wine glass before it was even half empty. When I approached, the greeting was polite, but unmistakably cool. "Mia, you made it," my mother said, offering a cheek that felt like parchment paper. She didn't ask how I was. Instead, neighbors and old family friends offered the same tired, condescending questions. "Still in the city, Mia? Still chasing those big corporate dreams?" They asked it with a pitying tilt of their heads, as if I had abandoned them, as if my success in Chicago was a tragic illness I hadn't recovered from. I smiled tightly, nodding while my internal monologue replayed the voice of my father from 10 years ago, echoing in this very room. "The company isn't for daughters, Mia." I looked at the heavy oak table, the same one where I'd been told my place was silent and decorative, and realized nothing had changed. They still saw me as a guest in my own history. The ambush didn't happen until the main course was cleared. The chatter died down as my father stood up, tapping a silver knife against his crystal goblet. The sharp ding-ding-ding cut through the room, silencing the room instantly. Beside him, Cole stood up too, smoothing his tie, trying to look regal, but mostly looking sweaty. My father cleared his throat, his chest swelling. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he boomed, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "This family has always been about service, about keeping this town alive." He placed a heavy hand on Cole's shoulder. "And today, your mother and I are proud to announce that we are finally naming Cole as the CEO of Jones Metalworks." He paused for effect, looking around the room to ensure everyone was absorbing the magnitude of the moment. "It is a sacrifice our family makes," he continued, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "to keep this town strong." The word sacrifice hit me like a physical slap across the face. The room erupted into applause, cheers, and teary-eyed nods from the old factory workers who saw the Jones name as a holy scripture. But I sat frozen. Sacrifice. I looked at Cole, grinning and raising his glass, basking in the adoration he hadn't earned. I remembered the nights I spent studying supply chains while he was partying. I remembered the strategies I wrote that he stole. I remembered every time I was sacrificed so he could shine. In that moment, amidst the clapping and the clinking glasses, the truth crystallized in my mind. They weren't just promoting him, they were trying to erase me. Again. They had staged this announcement here in public without a single phone call or warning to me because they knew I would have fought it. They wanted me ambushed, surrounded by witnesses, forced to smile and clap, while they handed my birthright to the son who barely knew how to read a balance sheet. I didn't clap. Instead, I set my water glass down on the table. I did it deliberately, bringing the heavy crystal down with a sharp, distinctive thud that cut through the applause near me. I didn't look at Cole. I looked straight at my father. He caught my movement, and his smile faltered just for a second. The applause began to die down as people reached for their drinks, but I held his gaze. "Are you sure?" I said, my voice quiet, but carrying perfectly in the sudden lull, "that you want to tell this story in front of everyone?" My father's eyes narrowed into slits. He leaned over the table slightly, his voice a low growl masked by a frozen smile. "Don't do this, Mia. Don't threaten your brother's moment." I felt a cold, dangerous calm wash over me. He thought I was making a scene. He thought I was just the jealous little sister acting out. He had no idea. The thing is, I thought, staring at his flushed, angry face, I wasn't the one threatening him. I looked at Cole, who was laughing at something a deacon said, wearing the crown they had just placed on his head. I already knew his crown didn't exist. As I watched him preen, the scene before me began to dissolve, the expensive dining room, fading away, replaced by the memory of where this really started, the smell of grease, the roar of machinery, and the factory floor, where I first learned that to survive this family, I had to become something they couldn't see. To understand what I did that night, you have to know how hard they tried to erase me from this story. My education didn't begin in a classroom. It began on the concrete floor of Jones Metalworks, trailing 3 steps behind my grandfather Henry Jones. I was 7 years old, wearing a pair of safety goggles that were constantly sliding down my nose, creating a world that smelled of ozone coolant and raw possibility. While other kids were learning nursery rhymes, Grandpa Henry was teaching me the anatomy of a supply chain. He would stop at a stamping press, the ground trembling beneath our feet, and pick up a single steel bolt. He'd hold it up to the fluorescent light like a diamond and shout over the roar of the machinery, telling me that this wasn't just a piece of metal. He said it was a promise. He explained how an order became a schedule became a product, and that product became a paycheck that fed a family in our town. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and told me that I saw the whole machine, not just the noise. That was the only time I felt seen, really seen, as something other than a decorative object. But the moment we stepped out of the factory and back into the domestic sphere, the rules changed. I remember a Sunday dinner when I was 10. My grandfather, still flushed with the energy of a good week, told the table that I had a head for business, bragging that I'd caught a math error in the shipping logs. I beamed, waiting for my parents to mirror his pride. Instead, my father Robert wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and offered a dismissive smile. He said I would make a great mom someday, effectively reducing my intellect to household management. My mother Karen didn't even look up. She just smiled tightly and asked if anyone wanted more potatoes, changing the subject before my ambition could stain the tablecloth. That was the rhythm of my childhood, Grandpa building me up, and my parents quietly, politely dismantling me. The erasure became explicit when I turned 12. There was a strategy meeting regarding a plant expansion, something I had heard Grandpa talking about for weeks. I asked to sit in, notebook in hand, ready to take notes. My father looked at me as if I had asked to fly the space shuttle. He told me I was a kid and directed me to go help my mother in the kitchen. 10 minutes later, I watched from the hallway as my brother Cole, 14 and bored, was ushered into the conference room. They had put him in a blazer that was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves swallowing his hands, and the men laughed, clapping him on the back and calling him the future CEO. I stood in the doorway holding a tray of coffee I was expected to serve and felt a cold realization settle in my chest. That was the night I learned the company belonged to the men, and my job was simply not to complain when they erased me from the narrative. By 16, I thought I could outwork their bias. I spent my summer break analyzing the plant's energy consumption, cross-referencing it with production shifts. I found a way to save the company 15% on utility costs just by restructuring the kiln schedules. It was a brilliant, simple fix inspired by things Grandpa had taught me. I printed the report, bound it neatly, and left it on my father's desk with a note signed in my own handwriting. 2 days later, I walked past the conference room and heard applause. Through the glass, I saw Cole standing at the head of the table holding my report. He was presenting it as his own idea. My father was beaming, telling the board he was so proud of his son's ingenuity. No one knew it was my work. No one even looked at the door where I was standing. That night, I confronted my father in his study. I was shaking, tears of frustration stinging my eyes, and I told him he had used my work. I expected an apology, or at least shame. Instead, he shrugged, pouring himself a drink. He told me we were a family, and sometimes we had to sacrifice a little credit for the greater good. He said Cole needed to learn this stuff, and needed the win to build confidence with the stakeholders. He told me not to be dramatic. When I looked to my mother for support, she just sighed and told me not to let jealousy threaten what my brother was building, reminding me that I would have my own life one day, implying that my life would be separate from the legacy I helped save. The final blow came when Grandpa Henry died. At the funeral, the whole town turned out talking about how he built this place from nothing. I stood by the grave feeling like the only person who had truly known him was gone. With him went my only shield. The day after the funeral, my father moved into Grandpa's office. The first thing he did was clear off the desk. There had been a framed photo of me and Grandpa at the factory, the one where I was wearing those oversized goggles. My father removed it and replaced it with a studio portrait of Cole. It was a small act, but it screamed louder than any argument. I had been evicted. I realized then that I couldn't stay. At 18, I quietly applied to out-of-state universities for finance, hiding the acceptance letters under my mattress. When I told my father, he scoffed. He called it a waste of money, insisting I would just get married and start a new family anyway, so why bother with a degree? He refused to pay a dime. I didn't argue. I took the scholarship I had earned, packed a single suitcase, and left before dawn on a Tuesday morning. I didn't wake anyone up to say goodbye. I walked out of that house and down the long driveway, the gravel crunching under my boots, telling myself I was free. I thought leaving would save me. I thought I could build a fortress of my own success where they couldn't reach me. I didn't know then that distance wouldn't be enough, and that years later they would find a way to threaten everything I built. Chicago was everything my hometown wasn't: loud, anonymous, and indifferent to my last name. My world shrank from a sprawling factory floor to a 300-square-foot dorm room shared with 2 other girls and the permanent smell of microwave popcorn. I traded the expansive Midwestern horizon for the gray view of a brick wall, and I loved it. I threw myself into the grind with a hunger that scared my roommates. I worked 2 part-time jobs, one scanning books at the library, the other pouring coffee for hungover grad students, just to cover the gap my scholarship didn't touch. My classes were my sanctuary. While other students complained about corporate finance and analytics, I devoured them. I became obsessed with case studies of distressed companies, dissecting their failures like a coroner. I looked at balance sheets and saw the same cracks I had silently observed at Jones Metalworks: the bloated management salaries, the deferred maintenance, the arrogance that mistook legacy for liquidity. I wasn't entirely alone in the concrete jungle. I found a tribe that didn't care who my father was. Jasmine, my roommate, taught me how to navigate the city subway and how to dress for a corporate interview on a thrift store budget. Dr. Lee, my toughest professor, became the mentor I had lost when Grandpa died. During office hours, when I confessed my fear that I was punching above my weight class, he looked at me over his spectacles and said, "Small towns don't define your ceiling, Mia. They only define your floor. You've already climbed out of the basement." I even found a quiet, grounding sort of love with Caleb, an EMT I met in the library. He was kind, steady, and dealt with life-and-death emergencies every day, which put my corporate anxieties into perspective. Our relationship was a safe harbor, but I kept romance secondary. My primary relationship was with my ambition. The real turning point came during my senior year internship at a mid-sized investment firm that specialized in turning around family-owned businesses. It was the perfect training ground. I was the intern who never left before 900 p.m. I ran financial models until my eyes blurred looking for patterns in the static. One evening, I was reviewing a potential acquisition for a client, a textile mill in Georgia. The senior analysts had signed off on it, but something in the inventory turnover didn't sit right with me. I stayed until midnight digging through 5 years of ledgers and found a hidden debt structure that would have bankrupted our client within 6 months. The next morning, I presented it to my boss, Monroe. He was a man of few words, terrifyingly efficient. He looked at my markup, then at me. "You see value where other people see noise," he told me. "That's rare." When graduation approached, Monroe offered me a full-time analyst role. The starting salary was more money than I had ever seen in my bank account. I sat in my tiny room with the offer letter in my hand, my thumb tracing the signature. My first instinct, conditioned by years of seeking approval, was to pick up the phone and call home. I wanted to hear my father say "good job," but I stopped myself. I realized that if I called, he would find a way to diminish it. He'd ask why it wasn't a bigger firm, or he'd ask when I was coming home to settle down. In that silence, I made a choice. I signed the offer letter and didn't tell them. That paycheck, that title, that life, it was mine. The first real freedom is realizing you don't need your parents' permission to live your own life. Over the next 3 years, I mastered the invisible mechanics of power. I wasn't just crunching numbers anymore, I was learning the dark arts of corporate governance. I worked on deals involving trucking firms, tool manufacturers, and food processors' businesses, exactly like Jones Metalworks. I learned how ownership was split, how voting proxies worked, and how a controlling interest could be the weapon that either threatened or saved a company. I started taking tiny sums of my own money and buying single shares in random companies just so I could receive the shareholder packets and attend the virtual meetings. I wanted to understand exactly what rights an owner had down to the fine print. I studied bylaws like some people studied religious texts. Meanwhile, the distance from my family grew into a vast, silent canyon. The family group chat was a stream of consciousness I rarely participated in, mostly photos of Cole golfing or my parents bragging about Cole's initiatives at the plant. When my parents did call, it was never to ask about my career. It was always, "We heard Cole might be speaking at the Chamber of Commerce," or "Cole is thinking of buying a new truck." I became invisible again, but this time it was a strategic invisibility. I didn't correct them when they assumed I was a secretary. I didn't beg to be seen. I let them believe I was small because it kept me safe. Then came that ordinary Tuesday. I was sitting at my dual monitor setup, sipping lukewarm coffee, scrolling through a slide deck of potential acquisition targets for a client interested in distressed Midwest manufacturing. I was clicking through the profiles mechanically: high debt, falling revenue, aging leadership. Then I clicked to the next slide, and my hand froze on the mouse. The logo was pixelated, but I knew it better than my own face. The jagged gear, the iron stamp, Jones Metalworks, listed as high distress, potential liquidation, or sale. I stared at the screen, the hum of the office fading into a ringing silence. The debt ratios were catastrophic. The orders were in free fall. This was worse than negligence. This was a collapse. In that moment, the numbness I had carefully cultivated for years shattered. I realized my family hadn't just erased me. If they kept going, they were going to erase the whole town. My heartbeat didn't just speed up. It hammered against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. I stared at the projection screen in the conference room, the blue light casting long, sickly shadows on the polished table. I leaned in, squinting, hoping I was wrong, hoping it was a typo or a similar logo from a different state. But the numbers didn't lie. Debt-to-equity ratios that were bleeding red, inventory turnover that had stalled out completely, a liquidity crisis, that was weeks, maybe days away from becoming a catastrophe. It was Jones Metalworks. My family's legacy was being shopped around in a slide deck of distressed assets labeled effectively as roadkill for vultures like us to pick over. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had to grip the edge of the table to keep my hands from shaking. Mia Monroe asked, noticing my intensity. "You see something?" I forced my voice to remain steady, burying the daughter and summoning the analyst. "The ownership structure," I said, pointing to the vague summary on the slide. "How recent is the owner engagement?" "It looks like they're bleeding cash on operational inefficiencies. Absentee." Mostly the presenting associate shrugged. "Old school management. They're looking for a buyout to save face before the bank forecloses." Forecloses. The word echoed in my head like a gunshot. As soon as the meeting ended, I walked out of the room, bypassed my desk, and went straight to the emergency stairwell. The concrete walls were cold, the air stale. I dialed my father's number, my fingers trembling. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding annoyed. "Dad," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "Why is the plant on a distressed list? Is Jones Metalworks in trouble?" There was a pause, heavy and defensive. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. "Where did you hear that?" "You don't know what you're talking about, Mia. I'm looking at a prospectus, Dad. The numbers are public if you know where to dig. You're leveraged to the hilt." "We are managing it," he interrupted, his voice rising. "This is a temporary cash flow issue. Do not go spreading rumors, Mia. Don't threaten our reputation with your gossip." When I tried to press him on the debt, he cut me off with a scoff that I felt in my bones. "This is men's business, Mia. You work with computers and spreadsheets in a glass tower. This is real life. We produce things. You wouldn't understand the nuance." He hung up. I stared at the phone, the dial tone mocking me. I needed to know if Cole knew, if the future CEO understood that his kingdom was burning. I texted him, "Is the company being sold? Dad is acting strange." 3 minutes later, the reply came through. "LOL. Calm down, Mia. It's big business stuff. Mergers, acquisitions, high-level strategy. Don't embarrass yourself trying to sound smart." Then a second text. "Stay in your lane. The family has it handled." I leaned back against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. Stay in your lane. There it was again. The same lane they'd shoved me into as a kid, the quiet one, the sacrificed one, the erased one. They were drowning, taking the whole town down with them, and they were still too arrogant to grab the life preserver I was trying to throw. I left the building and found a bench outside, surrounded by the rushing noise of the city. I felt numb. A deep, hollow ache opened up in my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call them back and scream that I evaluated companies worth billions for a living, that I had saved businesses far more complex than a metal fabrication plant, that I was the only one in the family who actually understood what was happening. But I didn't. I sat there watching the traffic and let the anger cool into something harder, something sharper. Silence used to mean they'd erased me. Now silence meant I was sharpening the knife. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, my laptop glowing in the dark, and I went to war. I pulled every public record I could find. I dug up the original incorporation documents from 50 years ago. I found the shareholder registers. And then at 3:00 a.m., I found the crack in their armor. I discovered that my grandfather Henry Jones had never consolidated the ownership. He believed in community. He had spread the shares among co-founders, early managers, and distant cousins. My father had a large stake, yes, but he didn't have 51%. He didn't have controlling interest. He just acted like he did because everyone else was too old or too passive to challenge him. I stared at the names on the screen. A moral crossroads opened up before me. I could walk away. I could let them crash and burn, let them learn the hard way. But then I thought about the workers. I thought about the guys who taught me to weld, the women in the front office who gave me candy, the town that relied on those paychecks. If I did nothing, I wasn't just letting my family fail. I was letting them erase everything Grandpa built and the people who trusted him. My father said it was men's business. Cole said to stay in my lane. Fine, I would stay in my lane. My lane was acquisition. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and typed a heading, Target Acquisitions. I started listing every minority shareholder I could find, calculating the percentages. I needed a majority. I needed to take the wheel before they drove the car off the cliff. My finger hovered over the first name on the list, Frank Alvarez, my grandfather's old right-hand man. It was 4:00 a.m., but I knew Frank was an early riser. I dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a gravelly voice answered. Mia. I wondered when you'd see the numbers. I've been waiting for you to call. A chill went down my spine, not of fear, but of recognition. That was the moment I stopped being the abandoned daughter and became something my family never saw coming, a threat. I met Frank Alvarez at a diner on the edge of town, a place where the coffee tasted like burnt hazelnuts, and the vinyl seats were cracked from decades of use. He was waiting for me in a corner booth, his hands still calloused from 40 years on the line wrapped around a mug. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. When I slid into the booth, he didn't waste time with small talk. He told me he remembered me as the little girl who used to follow Henry around asking why the machines made different sounds. He said, "Your grandfather always said you were the one who understood the business, Mia, not your brother. Cole likes the title. You liked the work." It was a validation I hadn't realized I was starving for until he fed it to me. I laid out my plan, terrified he would see it as a hostile coup. Instead, he nodded slowly. He told me he'd rather see me in charge than watch my father sacrifice the plant to his own stubborn pride. He signed the transfer documents right there between the salt shaker and the napkin dispenser. "Save the place," he said. "That's all I ask." That signature was the first domino. Over the next 3 weeks, I operated in a blur of quiet, strategic alliances. I didn't approach the big institutional investors. I went for the people my family had forgotten. I visited the widow of a former investor in a nursing home. She cried when I mentioned her husband's contribution to the early days of Jones Metalworks, telling me that my father hadn't sent a Christmas card in 5 years. She sold her shares to me because I remembered. I tracked down a second cousin who lived in Florida and despised Cole because of a childhood bullying incident. He signed his shares over with a vindictive grin, telling me he'd sell just to see Cole sweat. Then there was the old chief engineer forced into early retirement who grumbled that my parents never listened to logic. "Maybe you will," he said, signing the paper with a heavy, angry stroke. Each signature was a small piece of the crown my brother thought he was wearing, being quietly dismantled and reassembled in my hands. I couldn't let my family see me coming, so I brought in Hannah Park, a shark of a lawyer from my firm. We set up a series of holding entities, faceless LLCs, with boring names to keep the purchases discreet. I wasn't hiding out of shame. I was hiding for survival. I knew my father. If he saw his daughter buying up the company, he would burn it down before he let me take the helm. He would rally the board, poison the well, or drain the accounts. Secrecy was the only armor I had. The nights were the hardest. I sat at my kitchen table in Chicago, surrounded by stacks of share certificates and transfer agreements, the city lights blinking outside like indifferent stars. I wrestled with a heavy, suffocating guilt. Was I doing this to protect the town? Or was I doing this to hurt the people who had hurt me? I looked at the signatures of the people who trusted me. Frank, the widow, the engineer. They weren't betting on my revenge. They were betting on my competence. I realized then that my motivation could be dual. If saving the company also meant making my parents and brother face the reality of what they did to me, that wasn't revenge. That was justice. I wasn't stealing the company. I was catching it before they dropped it. I was closing in. I had accumulated 44% of the voting stock. It was a staggering amount, but it wasn't enough. I needed 51% to control the board, to fire the CEO, to stop the sale. I needed the final piece. That piece was Raymond Doyle. He was my grandfather's last surviving co-founder, a man who had left the company 20 years ago after a falling out with my father. He lived 2 states away in a cabin in the Smoky Mountains. He owned 7%. He ignored my first 3 emails. He let my calls go to voicemail. I was about to drive down there and knock on his door when my phone finally rang late on a Sunday night. "I figured it'd either be you or your brother," a raspy voice said. "I was hoping for you." We met in a small-town coffee shop halfway between his cabin and the highway. Raymond was frail, leaning heavily on a cane, but his mind was a steel trap. He didn't look at the paperwork I laid out. He looked at me. "Are you doing this to destroy your parents, Mia?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. I could have lied. I could have given him a corporate speech about fiduciary duty. But I looked him in the eye and gave him the truth. "No," I said. "I'm doing it so they can't destroy what Grandpa built, and so they can't erase me from it anymore." Raymond studied my face for a long, agonizing minute. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. "Your grandfather told me once that you were the only one who had the spine to make the hard calls. I think he was right." He slid the documents across the table and signed his name. I drove back to Chicago in a daze, the signed papers burning a hole in the passenger seat. I went straight to the office where Hannah was waiting. We filed the final transfer confirmations, watching the progress bar on the screen. When it hit 100%, Hannah turned to me, her face serious. "That's it, Mia. You own 51.4% of Jones Metalworks. You are the controlling shareholder. Legally, you decide who runs the company." I sat back in my chair, the adrenaline crashing into a wave of exhaustion and terrifying exhilaration. I felt the power of it, the sheer, undeniable weight of ownership. It was everything I had wanted since I was a little girl, asking to sit in on meetings, and everything I never should have had to fight this hard for. I looked at the calendar on the wall. It was Monday. Thanksgiving was 3 days away. I had the power to fire my own brother, and we were all expected at the dinner table on Thursday. We were back in the dining room, the air suffocatingly warm, frozen in the moment where my father had just toasted the sacrifice of the family. But this time the scene looked different to me. Before I had felt like a victim trapped in the corner of the frame. Now, as I watched Cole swirl his wine, looking flushed and victorious, I felt a strange, icy calm settling in my chest. My hand rested on my bag beneath the table, feeling the thick, reassuring shape of the manila envelope inside. They thought they were writing the end of the story, but they didn't know I had brought a pen. The tension at the table was palpable, though everyone was trying to drown it in Chardonnay. My parents were glowing, practically vibrating with pride as they fielded compliments about their son and the family legacy, erasing my grandfather's name and replacing it with their own narrative. A distant aunt leaned across the centerpiece, smiling at me with that cloying, pitying sweetness I had come to loathe. "It's good you have your own life in the city, Mia," she said, loud enough for half the table to hear. "You're so independent. You really don't need the company to be happy, do you? It's better left to the men." She minimized my entire existence with a wave of her fork, dismissing my connection to the very ground we stood on. Then the trigger pulled. Cole, emboldened by the wine and the applause, leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie. He addressed one of the old investors. "We've got some big changes coming," he bragged, his voice slurring slightly. "I'll probably have to lay off some people in the first quarter. You know, sacrifice a few jobs to keep the numbers pretty for the investors. Gotta trim the fat if we want to sell, right?" Trim the fat. Sacrifice. Those weren't numbers. Those were the families I grew up with. Those were the people Grandpa Henry had sworn to protect. The snap inside me was audible, at least in my own head. It was the sound of the last tether of loyalty breaking. I stood up. The movement was sudden enough that the silverware rattled on the table. The room went quiet, eyes darting toward me. My father, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, frowned. "Sit down, Mia," he commanded, his voice tight. "Don't ambush your brother like this. This is his night." "I'm not ambushing anyone," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor I expected. "I'm telling the truth." I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. It landed on the tablecloth in front of Cole and my father with a heavy, decisive slap that echoed in the silence. "What is this?" my father snapped, reaching for it. "Read it," I said. "Over the past year, while you were busy planning this party, I've been busy too. I've been acquiring shares. from Frank Alvarez, from Raymond Doyle, from cousins you haven't spoken to in a decade. My father froze his hand halfway into the envelope. He pulled out the summary sheet, his eyes scanning the lines, widening in disbelief. His face went from flushed to a pale, sickly gray. As of last week, I announced, projecting my voice to the back of the room so every single witness could hear, I legally own 51.4% of Jones Metalworks. That makes me the controlling shareholder, and legally I decide who runs this company. The explosion was instant. Gasps rippled through the room like a shockwave. An uncle at the end of the table muttered, "Is that even legal?" My mother stood up, knocking her chair over, her hands flying to her mouth. My father slammed the papers down, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. "You traitor!" he screamed, spittle flying. "You went behind our backs, you destroyed this family." "I didn't destroy it." I fired back, the years of suppressed anger finally finding a voice. "You did. You destroyed it when you decided that my only value was to be sacrificed. You destroyed it when you erased my work and gave it to him. You told me I'd never be more than a wife and a mother, that I didn't belong at this table. Well, I bought the table." Cole looked like he had been punched in the gut. He was shaking, staring at the documents as if they were a death sentence. "Mia, you can't do this," he begged, his voice cracking, all the CEO bravado vanishing instantly. "My whole life you said the company was mine. Dad said it was mine." "They lied to you, Cole," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "They said the company wasn't meant for me. But Grandpa built it for all of us. You're not the only Jones in this town." I turned to the rest of the room, addressing the stunned crowd. "Effective immediately, the sale of Jones Metalworks is cancelled. There will be no mass layoffs to trim the fat. I am appointing a new CEO, an external operations expert with 30 years of experience in turnarounds who actually knows how to run a factory. And I will be serving as the chair of the board to ensure this company stays rooted in this community." My father moved toward me. His fists clenched, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and humiliation. He looked at me like I was a stranger, a monster he had accidentally created. "If you go through with this," he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at my face, "if you humiliate your brother like this, you are no daughter of mine." It was the ultimate threat. The one that would have crushed the girl I used to be. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I looked at him, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a giant, but as a small, frightened man clinging to a world that had moved on without him. "You already tried to erase me, Dad," I said softly. "I'm just refusing to disappear." I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving the envelope on the table amidst the wreckage of the dinner. Behind me, I heard my mother sobbing and my father shouting, but I didn't look back. I grabbed my coat from the foyer and stepped out into the cool, dark air. I left that table knowing I had split my family in half, severing the connection forever. But as I looked toward the distant lights of the factory glowing against the night sky, I just hoped I had saved everyone else. If news travels fast in a city, in a small town, it teleports. By Friday morning, the narrative had already solidified. In the diner booths and church pews, Mia Jones had stolen the company from her own parents. I walked down Main Street to get coffee, and the silence that followed me was heavy and judgmental. People I had known my entire life looked away or whispered behind their hands. The story Cole had spun, that I had ambushed him out of jealousy and greed, was easier for them to swallow than the truth that their beloved local patriarch had nearly bankrupted the town. The fear at the plant was even more palpable. When I swiped my badge to enter the factory floor, the hum of machinery felt different, underscored by a terrified tension. To them, a takeover, hostile or otherwise, usually meant one thing: private equity, asset stripping, and mass layoffs. I was the wolf at the door. I didn't hide in the executive suite. I called a town hall meeting immediately, ordering everyone to the break room: the welders, the shift supervisors, the administrative staff. They stood with their arms crossed, faces hard and skeptical. I stood on a plastic chair so I could see over the sea of trucker hats. "I know what you've heard." I started, my voice shaking slightly before finding its rhythm. "You heard I stole this company. The truth is, I saved it." I didn't use corporate jargon. I projected the real financials onto the wall, the red ink, the debt, the looming sale my father had hidden. They were going to sell this place for parts, I told them, pointing to the numbers. I am not selling. We are retooling. We are investing in new CNC machines, and we are retraining every single person in this room to use them. The room didn't erupt in cheers. It simmered with doubt. An older worker, a man named Jim, who had worked alongside my grandfather, stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Your daddy said you're going to threaten our jobs," he shouted, pointing a grease-stained finger at me. "He said you city types only care about the bottom line." I met his gaze levelly. "The only thing I'm threatening, Jim, is the mismanagement that almost cost you your pension," I shot back. "I'm keeping the jobs. I'm firing the incompetents." The room went silent, but the tension didn't break. Later that evening, I walked to my rental car in the darkened lot and found a piece of notebook paper under the windshield wiper. It was scrawled in block letters, "Go back to the city before you ruin everything." I crumpled it up, my hands trembling, but I didn't get in the car. I went back inside and finished the shift reports. The real toxicity, however, came from my brother. Cole didn't show up for the transition role I had graciously offered him. Instead, he spiraled. He spent his days at the local dive bar buying rounds for anyone who would listen to his tale of woe. 3 nights after the takeover, he showed up at my rental house. He was drunk, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He banged on the door until I opened it. "You happy now?" he slurred, stumbling into the hallway. "You didn't just erase my title, Mia. You erased me." He looked broken, a man whose entire identity was built on a promise that was never real. I felt a pang of pity, but I suffocated it with necessity. "Now you know how it felt," I said quietly. "For 20 years, Cole. That's how I felt every single day." I looked at him, steady and unyielding. "Go home, get sober, get therapy, and get a real job where you actually do the work. But don't you dare come here and play the victim." He stared at me, seeing the steel in my spine for the first time, and stumbled back out into the night. Slowly, agonizingly, the tide began to turn inside the factory. I implemented new safety protocols that the previous management had ignored due to cost. I stopped the mandatory unpaid overtime abuse. I learned the names of the night shift crew. 2 weeks in, a line supervisor named Sarah, who had initially refused to look me in the eye, stopped by my office. "I didn't think you'd last a week," she admitted, leaning against the doorframe. "Your dad, he talked a lot, but you're actually listening. The guys appreciate the new ventilation fans." It was a small win, but it felt like a landslide. My parents, however, remained in a cold war. They refused to attend the shareholder meetings. When my mother finally called, it wasn't to reconcile. She was sobbing, her voice shrill with accusation. "How could you?" she wept. "You chose money over your family, Mia. You broke your father's heart." I gripped the phone, the old guilt trying to claw its way up my throat, but I pushed it back down. "I didn't choose money, Mom. I chose the truth. You are the ones who sacrificed your daughter for your son's ego. I just stopped letting you do it." I hung up, shaking, feeling both shattered and strangely invincible. The turning point in the town came when the local paper ran a front-page editorial criticizing the hostile takeover and questioning my loyalty to the community. I braced for another wave of hate. But the next day, the letters to the editor section was full. A group of longtime workers had written in, signing their names. They praised the transparency, the new equipment, and the fact that paychecks were clearing on time. They defended me. That morning, when I walked into the diner for coffee, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. Mr. Henderson nodded at me. The waitress poured my cup without the side of judgment. For the first time, people weren't just seeing me as Robert Jones's difficult daughter. They were seeing me as Mia Jones, the one keeping the lights on. 1 year later, the light hitting the conference room table looked different. It wasn't the harsh, artificial glare of the fluorescent tubes that used to hum in the old administrative wing. It was natural sunlight pouring in through the new floor-to-ceiling windows we had installed during the renovation. I sat at the head of the table, not with a gavel, but with a notepad, listening to the hum of the updated machines vibrating gently through the floorboards below. Angela Price, the CEO, I had hired 6 months ago, stood at the screen. She was a formidable woman with graying hair and a mind like a diamond drill. She clicked to the final slide of the quarterly review, and the numbers told a story of resurrection. Jones Metalworks wasn't just surviving. We were off every distress list in the state. We were profitable, we were safe, and for the first time in 5 years, we were hiring. I walked through the lobby after the meeting, pausing at the wall of history. My father's shrine to himself was gone. In its place, I had commissioned a timeline that honored everyone who had actually built this company. There were black and white photos of the first shift workers from the 50s, candid shots of the women who ran the lines during the lean years, and right in the center, a restored photograph of my grandfather Henry. Next to it, I had placed a smaller frame me at 7 years old, wearing those oversized safety goggles, looking up at him with hero worship in my eyes. I touched the glass briefly. It felt like an anchor. I had reclaimed the heritage, but I had done it by widening the frame, not narrowing it. The silence from my biological family had eventually broken, but it wasn't the loud, dramatic shattering of the Thanksgiving dinner. It was a quiet, awkward crumbling. My father had attended a board meeting 3 months ago. He didn't sit at the head. He sat in a guest chair in the back. He looked smaller, stripped of the armor of his title. Afterward, he approached me in the hallway, unable to meet my eyes, and mumbled an apology for how he had treated me. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the past, but it was an admission that he had been wrong. My mother sent me a package a week later, a box of old photos she had found in the attic, pictures of me winning science fairs and math competitions that I thought she had thrown away. The note was short, written in her shaky script: "We were wrong not to see you." Cole was the biggest surprise. He had moved 2 towns over and taken a job in sales at a regional distributor, a job he got on his own without our last name opening the door. He wasn't invited to the board meetings, and he didn't ask to be. On Thanksgiving morning, my phone buzzed with a text from him. It was short, devoid of emojis or jokes. "I'm learning. That's because you forced me to." I stared at the screen for a long time. We weren't friends, and we probably never would be close, but he was becoming a man, and that was only possible because I had refused to let him remain a child wearing a king's costume. I accepted the apologies, but I maintained the boundaries. I visited them occasionally, but I didn't hand them the keys to my life or my company. Reconciliation didn't mean returning to the way things were. It meant building a new reality where I was safe. This year, Thanksgiving wasn't in the suffocating dining room of the Jones estate. It was in my apartment in the city. I had pushed 2 tables together and dragged in every mismatched chair I owned. The guest list would have given my father a heart attack. Jasmine was there pouring wine with a heavy hand. Caleb was carving the turkey wearing scrubs because he had to work a night shift later. Hannah, my lawyer, was debating labor laws with Angela Price. Aunt Susan, the one relative who had quietly supported me, was laughing loudly with 2 of the longtime factory workers I had invited. The air didn't smell like polish and repression. It smelled of burnt garlic, spilled gravy, and loud, raucous laughter. It was messy, imperfect, and completely real. I stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet, the cold city air biting at my cheeks. I looked out over the skyline, thinking back to that moment 1 year ago. The ambush, the word sacrifice, the way they had tried to erase me from my own story. They had told me to stay in my lane. They had told me I was a threat. They were right, but not in the way they intended. I was a threat to the lie they had been living. "They ambushed me, sacrificed me, threatened to erase me," I whispered to the wind. "But I didn't disappear. I rewrote the whole damn book." If you are listening to this and you feel like you're sitting at a table where you don't belong, listen to me closely. If your family, your parents, or anyone decides your worth is small, that doesn't make it true. They can try to erase you. They can threaten your place at the table. They can tell you that you are a sacrifice for someone else's glory. But as long as you are breathing, you have the power to flip the script. You don't have to accept the role they wrote for you. I turned back toward the sliding glass door. Inside, my chosen family was raising a toast, their faces warm and welcoming. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I wasn't the backup plan. My name is Mia Jones. I was the daughter they tried to erase. And this life, this company, this table is what happens when you refuse to stay erased. And so the ink dries on Mia's new chapter, proving that sometimes the absolute best revenge is simply refusing to disappear. If this story of claiming your power resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel for more audio dramas. What would you have done at that Thanksgiving dinner? Let us know down below because we read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.